Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and told herself, the way she had told herself every single morning for 5 years, that today would be fine. Just get through today. That was the whole philosophy now. Not dreams, not plans, not the future she had once mapped out in a spiral notebook during her junior year of college. Just today. Just this kitchen. Just these marble countertops that she would scrub until they reflected her face back at her like a mirror she wasn't supposed to look into. The Harrington kitchen was the size of her entire childhood home. She had never said that out loud to anyone, but she thought it every morning when she arrived, every morning when the motion sensor lights clicked on and flooded the room in that clean, expensive light that felt nothing like the yellowed bulb her mother kept above the kitchen table in Beaumont, Texas. That bulb had flickered for 3 years before Sarah's father finally replaced it. He'd climbed up on a kitchen chair, wobbling slightly, and Sarah, 9 years old, standing below with her arms outstretched as if she could catch him, had said, "Daddy, be careful." He had laughed and said, "Baby, I'm always careful." He was not always careful, but he was always there, and for a long time Sarah had confused the two things. He wasn't there anymore. Hadn't been for 5 years. She reached for the polishing cloth and started on the silverware, piece by piece, the way Vivian had shown her during the first week. Hold it up to the light. Check for streaks. Do it again if necessary. Do it again without being asked. Do it again and do not let your face show that you have already done it twice. Sarah had become very good at keeping her face neutral. It was perhaps the most valuable skill she had developed in this house, more valuable than the beurre blanc she had stayed up until midnight to perfect, more valuable than her ability to arrange hydrangeas in the exact configuration Vivian had demonstrated by physically taking Sarah's hands and moving them, like a puppeteer who didn't realize the puppet could feel. Today was the Harrington annual spring luncheon. 12 women. Old money, new money, and the kind of money that had simply always existed and never needed explaining. They arrived every April like a seasonal phenomenon. Silk blouses, understated jewelry, the particular kind of laughter that never gets too loud because getting too loud would suggest that something had genuinely surprised you, and nothing was supposed to genuinely surprise women like these. Sarah had been preparing since 4:30 in the morning. Not because Vivian had asked her to start that early. Because Sarah knew what it took, and she had always been the kind of person who did what it took without needing to be told, which was a quality that people like Vivian benefited from enormously and acknowledged almost never. The salmon had to be perfect. The napkins, Irish linen, pressed and folded into precise thirds, had to be perfect. The hydrangeas, sourced from the florist on Westheimer that charged $60 a stem and made Sarah's chest tighten every time she walked in holding Vivian's credit card, had to be arranged just so. Sarah had done all of it. She had also, while the salmon rested and the napkins cooled from the iron, stood at the kitchen window for exactly 4 minutes and watched the sun come up over the Harrington backyard, the pool, the pergola, the garden that a separate landscaping crew maintained twice a week, and let herself feel, just for those 4 minutes, the particular grief of a person who has worked very hard to end up somewhere that was never meant for her. Then the 4 minutes were over, and she went back to work. The guests arrived at noon. Sarah opened the front door, 12 times in 20 minutes, smile in place, hands extended for coats, and each time a woman crossed the threshold, Sarah became slightly less visible. That was how it worked. The more people filled the room, the more she receded. She had learned to move through a crowded space like weather, present and functional and utterly unworthy of remark. A woman named Cecilia, tall and sharp-jawed, handed Sarah her coat without breaking eye contact with the woman beside her and said, "The hydrangeas are a touch droopy, don't you think?" They were not droopy. Sarah had checked them 20 minutes before the first guest arrived, had adjusted 3 stems individually, had stepped back and looked at the arrangement the way her college art professor had taught her to look at anything, not at the parts but at the whole, at the shape the negative space made. They were not droopy. But Sarah smiled and said she would take a look, because that was the correct response, and because the correct response was rarely the honest one, and Sarah had made her peace with that. Or she had convinced herself she had, which is a different thing entirely. She served the first course without sound. She moved through the dining room like she was made of different material than the women at the table. Lighter, more transparent, designed to pass through the scene without disturbing it. She refilled the water glasses before they were half empty. She cleared each plate at the precise moment that clearing became appropriate. She had learned the rhythm of these lunches so well that she sometimes anticipated what would be needed before anyone at the table consciously knew they needed it, which meant she was, in a very real and unacknowledged way, the most perceptive person in the room. That was the part that settled in her chest like a stone she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing the weight. She was standing at the sideboard, pitcher in hand, when Vivian began talking about the neighbor's housekeeper and the irreplaceable vase. Sarah didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She had stood in enough rooms to know when a story was for the table and when it was for the air, floating free of any particular target. This story started at the table. Then it moved. The problem, Vivian said, her voice carrying the easy authority of a woman who had never once wondered if she was allowed to speak, is that you cannot teach certain people to value things they've never had. It's not cruelty to say so. It's just reality. She paused, the pause of someone selecting a word from a curated internal collection. There's a baseline of refinement. Either it's there or it isn't. You can train someone to clean a surface. You cannot train them to understand why the surface matters. 3 women nodded. 2 stuttered their plates. Cecilia made a murmur of agreement into her wine. Sarah stood 4 feet away and did not move. She thought about her mother, up before dawn 3 days a week to catch the early bus to the hospital laundry, who called every Sunday at exactly 7 and always asked first how Sarah was sleeping, not how she was doing, how she was sleeping, because her mother knew that sleep was where a person's real condition lived. She thought about her father on that kitchen chair, arms out, laughing. She thought about her thesis, 47 pages on enzyme-linked immunosorbent assays, a piece of scientific work her professor had called, in a letter Sarah still had folded in her wallet because some things you carry close, the strongest undergraduate research she had reviewed in over a decade. She thought about the night she had written the final page, 3 in the morning, empty coffee cup, the particular silence of a sleeping dormitory, the feeling of having made something real out of nothing but her own mind. She thought about the box under her bed in her studio apartment 40 minutes away by bus. The box where the degree sat, rolled in its rubber band, because she hadn't bought a frame for it. Because framing it had felt, at some point, like a kind of cruelty to herself, an artifact of a life she had set down and wasn't sure she was allowed to pick back up. She had set it down temporarily. That was 5 years ago. Vivian laughed. The table laughed with her. And then Vivian, without turning, without lowering her voice, without a single moment of hesitation that might have suggested she understood there was a human being 4 feet away who could hear every syllable, said, "Girl, we need more bread." Not Sarah. Not excuse me. Not please. Girl. Sarah set the pitcher down on the sideboard. She set it down the way she set everything down in this house, carefully, quietly, without a sound. And then she stood up straight, and she felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been wound tight for 5 years, something that had been waiting, maybe, for exactly this word on exactly this day to finally, come loose. She turned around. And she spoke. My name is Sarah. 2 words. 4 syllables. The simplest sentence in the English language. And yet the moment they left her mouth, the entire room changed temperature. She felt it, the way you feel a weather shift before the rain actually arrives, that particular drop in pressure that held breath quality in the air. 12 women at a table set with Irish linen and $60 hydrangeas, and every single one of them had gone completely, absolutely still. Vivian turned slowly. Not quickly. Quickly would have suggested alarm, and Vivian Harrington did not do alarm. She turned the way a person turns when they are certain, absolutely certain, that whatever they are about to face will be manageable. She had spent 61 years being certain of that, and it had always been true. Until right now, in her own dining room, on a Tuesday in April, with the salmon half-eaten and the hydrangeas perfectly arranged and the woman she had employed for 5 years standing at the sideboard looking at her with eyes that were steady in a way that made Vivian's certainty feel, for the first time, like a thing that could break. I beg your pardon. Vivian said. And Sarah, who had rehearsed nothing, who was running on something older and deeper than rehearsal, something that lives in the body and waits, Sarah said it again. Clearly. Without rushing. My name is Sarah Malley. I have worked in this house for 5 years. She wasn't performing. That was the thing that made it devastating. She wasn't performing at all. She was simply telling the truth in a room that hadn't heard it in a very long time. I know every corner of this house. I know that the 3rd step on the back staircase creaks and it's never been fixed. I know your husband takes his coffee with 1.5 sugars because he's trying to cut back and hasn't told you yet. I know your daughter cries in her room sometimes after school, and I have left a glass of water outside her door on those days because no one else seemed to notice. Something moved across the face of the woman at the far end of the table. The quiet one, the one who had said almost nothing all afternoon. Her name, Sarah did not know. But her face, that face, Sarah would remember for the rest of her life, because it was the face of a person recognizing something true that they had been trying very hard not to think about. Her eyes filled and didn't spill, and she pressed her lips together and looked down at her plate, and that small private moment was somehow the most honest thing that had happened in that room all year. Sarah kept going. She was not angry. That was the part she would try to explain to her mother later and find she didn't have quite the right words for. She was not angry. Anger would have been easier to dismiss. What she was, standing there with her hands loose at her sides and her voice level and her eyes on Vivian's face, was simply done. Done with making herself smaller than she was. Done with folding herself into the shape the room required. Done with the performance of invisibility that had cost her, every single day, something she could not name but could feel, a slow, steady withdrawal from an account she hadn't realized had a limit until right now, when she checked the balance and found it empty. "I have a degree in biochemistry," she said. "From the University of Houston. I graduated with honors. My thesis on immunological research was called the strongest undergraduate work my professor had reviewed in a decade, and I have the letter to prove it, and has been sitting in a box under my bed because I let myself believe, somewhere along the way, that it belonged there." She paused. Just a breath. "I took this job 2 weeks after my father's funeral because the bills arrived before the grief did, and I told myself it was temporary, and then temporary became a year, and a year became 5, and somewhere in those 5 years I stopped correcting the timeline because it hurt too much to look at directly." Her voice did not waver. "I am not a different category of person. I am a person. And I have been standing in this room, present and listening and capable, every single time you forgot that." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the fullest silence Sarah had ever stood inside. Vivian's face had moved through several expressions and arrived somewhere cold and compressed and final. "You are finished here," she said. "Collect your things and go." "I know," Sarah said. "I came to that conclusion about 4 minutes ago." She untied her apron. She folded it the way she had been trained, neatly, corners aligned, the way you fold something that belongs to someone else and you are returning it in good condition because that is who you are regardless of how you have been treated. She placed it on the sideboard. She retrieved her bag from the kitchen hook. She did not rush. She did not look at the floor. She walked through the dining room, past the table, past the hydrangeas that were not droopy, past 12 women who were very quiet in 12 different ways, and she kept her chin level and her shoulders back not because she was making a point but because she was 31 years old and she was done walking through rooms hunched over her own spine. At the door she paused. She turned back, not for drama, but because there was one more true thing, and true things deserve to be said. "The beurre blanc," she said, "took me until midnight to perfect. I hope you enjoy it." She closed the door behind her. Gently. She had always been good at closing doors. The sunlight outside was the kind of April sunlight that feels almost apologetic after a long winter, warm but tentative, like it isn't sure yet if it's allowed to stay. Sarah stood on the Harrington front steps for exactly 3 seconds, breathing it in, and then she started walking. Down the long driveway, past the boxwoods, past the fountain that she had scrubbed green algae from every October, past the 2 cars in the motor court that together cost more than the hospital bills that had changed the entire direction of her life. She walked past all of it and she did not look back, and the feeling in her chest was not triumph. It was quieter than triumph, and cleaner. It was the feeling of having finally told the truth in a room that needed to hear it, and of having walked out still intact. The bus came in 11 minutes. She sat by the window and watched the neighborhood shift and breathed slowly and thought about her father. She thought about him on that kitchen chair, arms outstretched, laughing. She thought about the way he used to say her full name when he was proud of her, not Sarah, but Sarah Michelle, in a voice that made it sound like something worth announcing. She thought about the last time he said it, in the hospital, his voice already thin and far away, and how she had leaned in close so she wouldn't miss a syllable. She thought about how grief was a strange country, how you could live in it for years and still turn a corner and find a room you hadn't been in before, still find something new to mourn, still find his voice in a moment you weren't expecting it. She thought he would have stood up and clapped. Her mother called at 6, the way she always called at 6, and Sarah told her everything. The beurre blanc, the table, the silence, the apron folded on the sideboard. Her mother listened without a word, which was rare, which told Sarah everything about how well she understood the size of it. When Sarah finished, the pause stretched long and warm across the phone line, and then her mother said, quietly, "Your father would have been so proud of you, baby. He always was." And Sarah, who had not cried once during the entire afternoon, who had stood in that dining room with dry eyes and a level voice, pressed her phone against her cheek in her small apartment and cried in the dark for a little while. Not from sadness, not entirely, but from the particular release of a person who has been holding something enormous for a very long time and has finally set it down. Monday arrived the way Mondays do, plain and full of possibility in equal measure. Sarah sent the email to the pharmaceutical lab at 7:45 in the morning, before she could talk herself out of it. Entry-level research assistant, a posting she had flagged 8 months ago and returned to 17 times without ever hitting send. She hit send. Then she made coffee and sat at her kitchen table, a small table, a scratch table, a table that had come with the apartment and had never been hers exactly, but that the morning light hit in a way she had always found quietly beautiful, and she thought about what it meant to choose yourself. Not dramatically, not in a single grand moment, but in the small, specific, daily act of refusing to stay somewhere that required you to disappear. 3 weeks later, she sat across from Dr. Priya Anand, who had read Sarah's undergraduate thesis before the interview and said, without preamble, looking up from the pages with an expression of genuine interest, "This is impressive work. I mean that." And Sarah, who had spent 5 years being invisible, 5 years being girl, 5 years folding her apron corners aligned and leaving glasses of water outside doors and staying up until midnight to perfect a sauce for a table that would never say her name. Sarah looked back at this woman who had said her work was impressive and felt something she recognized from a long time ago, from lecture halls and late nights and a spiral notebook full of plans, from a version of herself that had existed before the funeral and the bills and the box under the bed. She felt like herself. She got the offer on a Thursday. She accepted before the email finished loading. That same Thursday evening, in a house with marble countertops and Irish linen napkins and a chandelier above the kitchen island, Vivian Harrington stood alone in her dining room and tried to arrange the hydrangeas for a dinner party that was 3 days away. She had sent the third placement agency hire home at 4. The girl had folded the napkins into quarters. Vivian had corrected her twice. The girl had nodded and done it again wrong, and Vivian had felt a frustration so acute it had a taste. She stood at the vase now, moving stems, stepping back, moving stems again. Something was wrong with the arrangement and she couldn't locate what. She had been standing here for 12 minutes and the hydrangeas looked, she realized, with a slow and unwelcome clarity, droopy. She had arranged them herself and they looked droopy, in exactly the way Cecilia had described, and they had never looked that way before, not once, not in 5 years of spring luncheons, because Sarah had always arranged them and Sarah had known something about it that Vivian had never thought to ask and now could not ask and would never know. She stood in the quiet house and she understood, fully and without the comfort of any possible excuse, that there was a skill in what Sarah had done, not just the flowers but all of it, the whole careful architecture of an invisible life maintained with precision and care and a dignity that Vivian had never once acknowledged, and that the skill had been real, and the person had been real, and the name had been Sarah, and she had said it 4 feet away from her every day for 5 years and Vivian had simply chosen not to hear it. She didn't call anyone to say so. There was no one to call. Some understandings come too late to become apologies. They simply become the weight you carry, shapeless, private, yours, in the exact form of a door closing softly long after the person who closed it has already moved on to somewhere she was finally, completely, seen.